was really striking to me was something that Dr. Galliano said to me around the fact that studies, that posit someone would become pro-environmental, they don't exist in indigenous cultures where these psychedelics originated, right? Iboga, ayahuasca, psilocybin have been used for centuries. And there's not that discussion about nature being out there, something that we need to solve or, protect, because there's an understanding that that separation is impossible. We're just as much nature as the thing that we call nature, is what she said to me.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Simran Sethi. Simran is a narrative practitioner and independent scholar focused on personal, social, and environmental change. Her current research as a visiting academic at the Open University in the UK is on the biocultural diversity of earth medicines and communities and lands that steward them. A recent story in Nautilus was, Can Tripping Save the Planet? Simran, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Brian.
So, to start off, would you mind summarizing your intellectual background as well as your work as a writer?
Sure. So, intellectually, I have an MBA focused on sustainability and background in sociology and women's studies, undergrad. My research focus when I was associate professor at the University of Kansas was on environmental reporting in the School of Journalism. And I'm the author of a book on the loss of agricultural biodiversity called Bread, Wine, Chocolate, The Slow Loss of Foods We Love. That book was really sort of the spine of my work around looking at environmental challenges such as the climate crisis, biodiversity change and loss. And that sort of expanded around looking at culture. And then as I explored the cultural piece, looking kind of within. So I'm a graduate student again, and in the UK at the University of East London, looking at post-traumatic growth and psychedelics. And in terms of my work as a writer, I've written for a number of publications in addition to working on books, such as the one I mentioned. I've written for The Times, The Washington Post, The Guardian, Guernica, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Smithsonian, and of course, Nautilus.
Nice, nice. Right on. So, why don't you give us a brief summary of the piece you just wrote for Nautilus for those of our viewers who haven't read yet?
Sure. So the question around, can tripping help save the planet? The answer is it might. We're seeing a glut, a gold mine, a landslide of research coming out around psychedelics and fill in the blank. So, does psychedelics help reduce alcohol disuse order? Does it, how does it help people when they're facing end of life challenges, around terminal illness? Looking at studies with anorexia nervosa, looking at so many things. And what I was curious about and was sort of going back and forth with my editor at Nautilus was, what about environmental issues? Because what we know, Anthony Bostic and from NYU and Mary Cosimano from Johns Hopkins University have both talked about like the universalities around psychedelics, specifically around experiences of oneness. So no matter what you were kind of reaching for when you were experiencing or having a psychedelic experience, what they saw was there was this kind of thing that kept coming up, this recurring theme of oneness and connection. So when it comes to environmental issues, especially in the face of the climate crisis and staggering, terrifying biodiversity loss, I wanted to sort of explore, what did the data show? And what the data shows is that when people take psychedelics, even when they take them in clinical environments, that there is a deeper sense of oneness and this connection with the world around them. In March of 2022, scientists from Hopkins, the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, led by Sandeep Nayak, found that even a single psychedelic experience could change a person's mind about their relationship with beings outside of the human realm, right? So non-human beings, animals, plants, what have you, and a recognition that they possess consciousness. And these mystical feelings actually mediate really profound changes. That's what psychedelic researcher Kelly Paterniti of the Queen Mary University of London found. She authored a recent study called The Relationship Between Psychedelic Use, Mystical Experiences, and Pro-Environmental Behaviors. And that last bit is kind of the hinge. What we call pro-environmental behaviors, or PEBs, are acts of conservation, right? Are recycling, are shopping differently. So there's first of all that idea of like, do psychedelics like help inspire pro-environmental consciousness or pro-environmental connection, right? Do you feel that sense of connection with your environment? The answer is yes and yes. But then the question is like, well, does it translate into action? And what Paterniti found through an online survey of 245 people was that when they had a complete mystical experience, so that deep connection with oneness that comes from some of those higher dosage experiences with psychedelics, that people did end up acting in pro-environmental ways. But of course, what we always have to remember is correlation is not causation, right? So we don't know if these folks had pro-environmental leanings before they took psychedelics. Maybe that's what inspired them to take psychedelics. I have a nice bit of feedback from another researcher at Hopkins, Manoj Das, kind of sharing that skepticism. Because these are always done after the fact, we don't want to overestimate the power. But what we see is that studies on psychedelics and environmentalism show that there is a relationship. We just don't know if there's necessarily a direct link between consuming a psychedelic and then engaging in that behavior. Anecdotally, I will say what was also really inspiring to me in wanting to write this piece was the experience that Extinction Rebellion co-founder Gail Bradbrook has shared around going into the jungle, consuming ayahuasca and iboga, and coming out with a sense of knowing what she needed to do to be more effective in the world. And that was launch this, radical environmental direct action organization called Extinction Rebellion. I'll add a couple of more bits. Monica Galliano, who's an associate professor in evolutionary ecology at Southern Cross University in Australia, was really helpful in reminding me that if psychedelics had these amazing kind of effects, why weren't we seeing a radical shift in the climate crisis or around environmental issues? And so what she stressed was that the substances can illuminate the work that needs to be done, and Bradbrook is a great example of that. But we've got to commit to engaging. Like we have to go out in the world and actually do the work.
Right. Why do you think mystical experiences seem to encourage us to construe ourselves as being more a part of nature?
Well, the mystical experiences bring about something known as ego death or ego dissolution. So it's our sense of self kind of, for lack of a better term, dissolves, and we feel a greater connection with people around us, with nature, and again, even if you're in that clinical setting, you're still feeling that connection with nature. So it's really about that experience, that mystical tendencies bring about. So there's a lot of layers here, Brian, and I guess that's what sort of gets a little tricky. We still don't fully know how the brain works, right? And now we're introducing psychedelics and we don't fully know how they work, but we're seeing certain things that surface when people are consuming these substances. And that is that sense of oneness that is precipitated by mystical experiences, which manifest this sense of ego dissolution.
Right on. Yeah. What makes me think of when people take these substances and have a mystical experience, you mentioned perhaps they already had some pro environmental views, and perhaps the mystical experience kind of crystallizes their resolve, and now they have the motivation to actually act on their beliefs. But if they didn't already have those views, perhaps the mystical experience, the oneness with nature, sort of provokes a curiosity about how they can learn what they can do to be better stewards of the environment. But yeah, it would be interesting to see more studies on that, like whether it boosts curiosity about what they can do if they don't already have those pro environmental views.
Right. And rewinding that even further, we don't know if the folks who are inclined to take psychedelics are already also expressing a greater interest in the environment, right? So if we think of that like stereotypical like hippie taking dropping acid, right, trope, then we would see that like actually we don't know which one of those came first. So it's really about a
Hmm.
lot of rewinding, we haven't also done any comparison studies. So there's no real way to say with certainty that there's that one will affect the other, or bring about the other.
Mhm. Can you tell us any more interesting tidbits or anecdotes or ideas that you had for the piece that you planned on having them in, as part of the story, but ended up cutting them or doing something else?
Yeah, I mean, recognizing the limitations of the medical model that exists in the West and of Western science, right? As opposed to, what is a growing body of interest in what is, being called indigenous science. That I think one of the other things that came up in the research was just that awareness that some of this is transcends what it is that we understand in research, right, in clinical trials, and I cite actually Roland Griffiths, who's quite well known in this space, and all the work that he's now focused on. His whole life he's been focused on end of life and psychedelics, right? For I don't know his whole life, I don't want to say, but in his research for several decades, and there's that ineffability, right? That sort of intangible quality that isn't really being captured in the data, or it's being captured in very clinical ways, but it's something that, again, just by the word ineffable, it's like it's hard to quantify, it's hard to formulate research questions around. So what was really striking to me was something that Dr. Galliano said to me around the fact that studies, that posit someone would become pro-environmental, they don't exist in indigenous cultures where these psychedelics originated, right? Iboga, ayahuasca, psilocybin have been used for centuries. And there's not that discussion about nature being out there, something that we need to solve or, protect, because there's an understanding that that separation is impossible. We're just as
Mhm.
much nature as the thing that we call nature, is what she said to me. And there was some research also that I surfaced from ethnoecologist Janine Pfeiffer, who wrote in her defense of indigenous science and ways of knowing that countless forms of bias prevail, and that they influence the research questions that are asked, the people who get to ask them, how the questions are asked, where the scientific efforts are focused, what gets funded, I would add as well. So there's just so many constraints, and I think what psychedelics do is often blow people open to go beyond these constraints. And so for me, I think it's really important to recognize that this expansion of consciousness, this mind altered state, that comes from the cultures that have stewarded plants and psychedelic practices. That we need to do more work there. We need to not only look at sort of what the medicine, I'll say, or the substance, perhaps is a better word, does, but look at the cultures that have stewarded them and get a better understanding of the greater context these have been traditionally consumed. That to me is going to share a lot, or reveal a lot around where the research needs to go.
Right on. What are you working on the moment? Perhaps you could talk about a project you're involved with at the Open University.
Yeah, so I'm working on a couple of different things, as many freelance writers are. Finishing up right now a profile of the founder of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. Her name is Ifatayo Harvey. Working on research around post-traumatic growth and psychedelics. So getting a deeper understanding of sort of what post-traumatic growth is, and how psychedelics might support that. And then at the Open University, starting to do research for a book that I want to write around, it's an expansion of the book that I already wrote, which was around the loss of agricultural biodiversity told through bread, wine, coffee, chocolate, and beer. And flavor, right? So how can we save biodiversity by savoring? And now it's expanding that to look at psychedelics. So going from food to medicine, and really starting to get a grip on kind of what the biocultural implications are, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of culture, when we kind of expand psychedelics into this medicalized model, into a more capitalistic system. So there's some really important stuff to look at to ensure that we're protecting the cultures that have stewarded psychedelics, as well as the plants themselves, and the animals. I should say there's a lot of animal medicine involved as well.
That's fascinating. I love how you bring all of those different elements together. That I would love to read that when it's ready. Um,
Excellent.
Do you want yeah. Do you wanna tell our viewers where they can find you online to follow more of your work? Do you have a website? Are you on social media?
I am on the socials, have dropped off Twitter. I'm on Instagram and on LinkedIn at Simran Sethi. That's SIMRANSETHI. And then I'm also have my own website, which is simransethi.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Simran, for talking with us about your story. And as I
Absolutely.
said, look forward to seeing more of your work coming out.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Brian.